AIAA's Space Commerce Lecture and Awards presentation. We're happy that you're joining us today. If you're listening in real time, and if you are joining us for a replay, we're glad to have you with us as well. I'm Dave Thompson, a past president of AIAA and a retired president and CEO of Orbital ATK and one of its predecessor companies, Orbital Sciences Corporation. The Space Commerce Lectureship is one of 7 AIAA Lectureship Awards. It is the newest and one of 2 such awards that focuses more broadly on business and public policy matters, as opposed to the historical group that tended to center around engineering and operations in aircraft and space systems. This Space Commerce Lectureship is designed to recognize a prominent industry leader who has created or grown a space-related business that has gone on to generate substantial economic value, rapid customer growth, and enhanced market value. And it's my really distinct pleasure to introduce this year's Space Commerce Award winner, Mr. Eddy Hartenstein. As I think most of you know, Eddy was the founder and long time president and CEO of DirecTV, and today is the lead independent director of another major satellite service company, Sirius XM Radio. DirecTV is the world's largest space-based business. It marked its 25th year of operations last year, and at that time providing satellite-delivered television, audio, and internet services to over 20 million households in the US and throughout Latin America. It currently generates in excess of $30 billion a year in annual revenue. As its founding executive and longtime president and CEO, Eddy orchestrated DirecTV's conception, development, and growth from 1990, when the initial planning began at what was then Hughes Electronics, through 2014, by which time DirecTV was providing about 500 channels of digital television and audio to nearly 15 million households in the United States. With degrees in aerospace engineering and mathematics from Cal Poly Pomona and in applied mechanics from Caltech, Eddy joined Hughes Aircraft Company in 1972, and by the early 1980s was Hughes's vice president and lead executive for the original Galaxy commercial satellite fleet. During his subsequent 15 years as the leader of DirecTV, Eddy oversaw all aspects of the satellite TV business, including satellite and launch vehicle acquisition and operations, consumer hardware manufacturing and installation, programming, marketing, distribution, financing, regulatory affairs, and everything else associated with creating this brand new business. As a result of his leadership, this concept of direct-to-consumer satellite services was transformed into one of the most successful new product launches in consumer electronics history, propelling DirecTV into its position as the largest and most successful space business since the advent of the space age. In recent years, Eddy has served as chairman of Tribune Publishing and president and CEO of the Los Angeles Times, one of the largest metropolitan newspapers in the country. As I mentioned earlier today, he's the lead independent director of Sirius XM Radio, another terrific satellite success story with some 35 million subscribers to its satellite radio broadcasting and internet services. Eddy is a member of the U.S. National Academy of Engineering. He was inducted into both the Broadcasting and Cable Hall of Fame and the Consumer Electronics Association Hall of Fame, and received an Emmy Award for Lifetime Achievement from the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences. As DirecTV marked its 25th year since Eddy and his team founded the company, the remarkable story of the technical and business innovations in which advances in space technology and related consumer electronics allowed satellite delivered information to be directly accessed by nearly 100 million people. This is both a central chapter in the space industry's commercial development and also a useful guide to its immediate future. In fact, as was noted in Eddy's nomination package for this award, a discussion of space-based businesses and the foundational innovations that power them without a prominent role for Eddy and direct.
Well, it looks like Dave is
Like
in limbo
a study
at
of
the
solar
moment.
stuff
Yeah.
out. Great use. Sorry. It's my great pleasure to introduce Eddy, and after his lecture, we'll be entertaining any questions you may have, so please add them to the chat box, and we hope to get to as many of these as possible. But now I invite Eddy to speak on his lecture, Communication Satellites, Then, Now, and Where Next. Eddy.
Thank you, Dave. Quite flattering. While there is an I in DirecTV, there's no I in team or teamwork. And one person alone could not have done this. Had a terrific team, and we'll try to mention some of the folks along the way here. I chose, after Dave told me about this and offered it to me, to talk more about a bit of a history of satellite communications from one person's view, as opposed to this being a lecture. As Dave indicated, we'll take some questions at the end and hopefully cover it. Dave, you've done a terrific job of outlining some of the things that I was going to talk about, and I'll try not to repeat them. But in any history of satellite communications, it's impossible to not interweave with that the history of Hughes. Started with Hughes aircraft, and I have often mused and thought that had Howard himself lived long enough, or perhaps wherever he is now, looking down upon what we achieved at DirecTV, given his varied interests and pursuits, which encompass movie producer to aircraft designer to raconteur and many things in between, he would nod and smile approvingly of what it is we did. There was a great debate amongst classical, Hughes people. Gee, we should have the name Hughes in the name of the service, but I strongly believe that would have been somewhat not relevant, and I think Howard himself would have agreed with that, and hence we chose a name which was descriptive of what the actual service was, DirecTV. Very early on, we never really focused on the fact that it was satellite delivered, but again, we were not a technology in search of a marketplace, but rather serving a market need. The history of Hughes was really great, comes from many firsts back to the SYNCOM satellites back in the 60s, even the Surveyor program, the soft landing of the moon. Many people all realize that we did soft land on the moon unmanned with Surveyor. That was Hughes's doing. But there were 4 or 5, maybe even 6 rather hard, some would say crash landings before, which taught everybody at Hughes and generations like myself that followed those ultimate successes to never give up and keep trying. The leaders at Hughes, and then it was Hughes Aircraft Company, were mostly scientists. A couple of the names that stick out and that I have personal knowledge of were Harold Rosen, Tony Iarillo, both longtime AIAA members. Harold has passed. Tony is still alive and well and enjoying his well-earned retirement playing music, trumpet for any of you that are interested in it, and playing golf. But what I learned early on in my formal education, while yes, in aerospace engineering and math and applied mechanics, was more geared to systems engineering. Yes, with my aerospace engineering degree, I know what a Reynolds number is, but if you're hoping to discuss that today or talk about drag coefficients, you've tuned into the wrong speech. I'm not going to do that. But the many disciplines that were involved in satellites included orbital dynamics, RF, radio frequency electronics, propulsion systems, thermal management, power systems, electromagnetic discharge. And we had a variety of divisions within the space and communications group of Hughes Aircraft that dealt with NASA as a customer, commercial satellites, and of course, defense satellites, with none of us were allowed, and even to this day, to talk about. The late 70s, giving way to the 1980s, led to what I like to call the Model T, going to the Ford automotive analogy for satellites of being the HS, Hughes Satellite 376 series. These were spin stabilized. They looked like a big trash can. The early ones were a very simple little cylinder. The later ones actually dropped or telescoped down an additional panel, and they were spin stabilized, and they basically sat in geosynchronous orbits. And we can spend a whole nother day talking about the physics of geosynchronous satellites, but that's not today. Then came policy and politics. The Telecom Act of 1980, which was formulated by a group that was the Office of Telecommunications Policy, which included, among other people, Nino Scalia, the late Supreme Court Justice, Brian Lamb, who is the founder and still chair emeritus of C-SPAN. It included Tom Whitehead, who became the first president of Hughes Communications, and several other luminaries, including Henry Goldberg, who was a terrific telecommunications lawyer and regulatory expert back in there. And what it allowed was for what is called non-common carriers. Up until that point, if you needed satellite service, you could only get it from one of 2 carriers, Western Union or AT&T. They were rate regulated. You could lease, not own a transponder. And what we did as being a non-common carrier, and we anticipated this early on, was design and put into operation in the early 80s, the Galaxy communications fleet. And what we did there is simply allow owners such as HBO, such as Turner Broadcasting, to purchase the transponder and then depreciate it in a tax sense, much in the same way that a terrestrial broadcaster would buy a plot of land and put an earth station there and depreciate that. So we looked at the economics of it as well. The start of business people becoming leaders. I apologize for the brief interruption there. That's the Metrolink line going from downtown Los Angeles to points east in the eastern Southern California area. The transition were the not so much the scientists, but the business people became the leaders. And the mantra became follow the money. And that is cable television in the 70s and going into the 80s became a utility, much in the same way that it was oftentimes the first thing when you moved into a new house or started a new lease and as a renter, you'd call the cable company first. They were monopolies based on local franchises. Rural areas were left to fend on their own because it was not economic for a cable company to string cable up and down the crossroads of America, oftentimes a mile away from the next nearest house. And it just wasn't, feasible. The ideation of direct to home satellite service began in the 80s. And many of you remember that the frequency allowed for it then was in the C-band part of the spectrum. And you had a big articulated dish. And in order to receive the signals, that dish had to be on the order of 12 feet in diameter. And then it had to have an actuator arm, which typically had to be replaced after every winter because it froze up or rusted up. And you'd have to, when you switch from one service to another, wait for the slow-moving antenna articulator to move from one satellite to the other and then tune to the specific transponder frequency that service was on, all analog. Parallel developments began happening there. There was a quest to go from analog to digital. NHK over in Japan came up with a high definition digital thing. The problem is it chewed up as much bandwidth as an analog signal. Consumers' desire for better service, I think, basically became a driving force, the market force, and the spin to win, and that was the old mantra with Hughes, where the satellite had to be a spinner in order to win a contract, was no longer valid. Hughes's next generation of satellite were quite a thing to behold. That became the 601 satellite, and that came about in the early 90s. By that time, GM owned Hughes. The government declared Hughes's ownership did not qualify as a 501c3. So the idea of in whatever year Hughes made a profit, that they'd give those profits to the Howard Hughes Medical Institute did not qualify as a bona fide 501c3, forced the sale of it, and hence GMHE, General Motors Hughes Electronics, was formed. GMHE, as Hughes Aircraft was prior, was much more than just Space and Communications Group. It included Radar Systems Group, EDSG, the Electron Dynamics Systems Group, GSG, Ground Systems Group, MSG, the arm where we built missiles and weapons of mass destruction in the Missile Systems Group. Tomahawks to this day are still part of that. And we were all part of that acquisition in the mid to late 80s as GM took over. The Cable Act of 1992 was then something that came to fruition then, and it was one that we anticipated because, as Dave indicated, we started thinking about a real direct-to-home business in 1990. That coincided with the perfect storm, if you will. And the perfect storm that I'm talking about is you had consumers on one side and then all of the technology developments on the other side. Those technology developments started with higher lift capacity for launch vehicles, much larger satellites like the 601 was. And I think the transition from analog to digital. And this confluence of events led to us going to General Motors, not Hughes, because General Motors, as the ultimate owner, didn't allow any expenditures that were above, I think, $40–50 million at the Hughes level. Anything above that had to go to GM. So we went there with a pitch, and the pitch was pretty simple. We want to buy 3 satellites, and oh yeah, we'd buy them from Hughes. We wanted to secure 2 launch vehicles. And by the way, we would not rely on the traditional launch vehicle manufacturers anymore, the Deltas, the Atlases, but we also went to then the upstart Arianespace. Later on, we went to SpaceX when SpaceX came there. We actually went to Sea Launch as well, which was an interesting combination with a Russian, a Ukrainian, a Norwegian, and a US-based company to launch our satellites. The promise was pretty simple. We would achieve 5 million subscribers within 5 years of launch, and we would pay back that initial roughly $300 million investment that we asked for. And an interesting story at the board meeting that we went to, on the way down there, the then leader of Hughes, was a brilliant PhD in RF analysis, asked me on the plane down there, well, gee, Eddy, what's the EIRP, effective isotropic radiated power, of this satellite that it's going to be able to work into little 18-inch dishes, you know, pizza-sized dishes that we called it, 18 inches. Having been an aerospace engineer and knowing enough about it, I was able to answer his question, knowing that that would never come up in the GM board meeting, but you know, the economics of it would. And got into the presentation at then in Dallas. One of the board members, Ann Armstrong, lived on a ranch, Armstrong Ranch, in the middle of nowhere of Texas. And I barely got halfway into describing what it was, and she said in her inimitable style, well, Eddy, if I may call you that, does that mean when I want to switch from, I think she said, satellite business news to ESPN, that I no longer have to wait for my big dish to go from transponder 13 on Westar 4 to transponder 7 on Telsat 302. And she says, well, that's brilliant. I can do that with a little tiny 18-inch dish. Well, at that point, she had never participated that much in any things to do with the design of the passenger side door handles of the latest Oldsmobile that was coming out at the time. But every other board member looked at her and said, okay. I put my slides down, and that was it. I only got about a third of the way through the deck and finished well within only half of the allotted time, got the approval. The rest, as they say, is history. So how did a high-tech aerospace company pull this off? Well, the number one thing was that we were, sorry, I'm checking with my notes here. Yeah. Number one, we had independence from the mothership. That rubbed some people at the headquarters of Hughes a little wrong. We had our own building, and we were actually geographically a little distance from where they had moved to, which was up in Westchester, Los Angeles, and we were down in El Segundo. And we were not afraid to bring in outside experts, quite frankly, because we needed to. Now, had GM really done their due diligence, they would have asked all kinds of questions like, well, how's this really going to work? We know how you know how to do satellites, but we had to get partners for the consumer electronics development, billing systems, customer service, content agreements that we had to have, encryption technologies. So we launched all of this business, and we had to guess ahead because the gestation period for building and launching satellites was approximately 3 years. We had our first commercial day of service on June 16th, 1994. But there was much more to do. Point to multipoint, which satellite is as an efficient delivery system, worked well for nationwide services, but it did nothing. And we all know what those nationwide cable services are, but we literally had to shepherd through Congress a bill, if you can imagine this, that would allow satellite operators like ourselves the ability to transmit local stations into local markets. Well, if you break down what local stations are, they are things called DMAs, designated marketing areas, of which there are 210 in the United States. Number one market is, no surprise, New York. Number two, LA, Chicago, Philadelphia, Dallas, Fort Worth, et cetera, all the way down to Glendive, Montana, which has something like 3,000 households. And that in total has something like 3,000 local broadcast television stations. But we had placed our bets long before the passage of that bill, which President Clinton signed later on. And I think that is really DirecTV's crowning achievements, because the spot beam technology, the shape beam technology, the frequency reuse, backhauling all of those local stations to our broadcast centers to give customers wherever they lived, not only the spate of multi-channel national-based services, but all and even more of their local channels than they ever could before. And we did all of it in high definition. We, by the way, were instrumental in leading the force to MPEG-2 and then subsequently MPEG-4. We did hit 5 million by 1999, 10 million by 2004. That's when I retired from there. And News Corp took over and rode it to 20 million. And the business became more routine subscriber management, and that included acquisition of new subscribers, managing churn to keep the ones you had on there, paying their bills and coming on, and customer satisfaction. Simply put, we built a better mousetrap, and we did that. I think, Dave, you mentioned 20 million subscribers. Sadly, AT&T no longer has that. They're not a sponsor of this conference, and I'm not quite sure, well, I do know what they did, but that's a whole nother case study to be done by the Harvard Business School in terms of how to destroy value for a later date. In parallel, there were two satellite radio companies, and wisely, the FCC allowed them to merge. There was Sirius and there were XM, both struggling and competing hard against each other. And we merged Sirius XM. We were at DirecTV, the other part of being independent, an early investor in XM. And that company did for radio what DirecTV did for television, except that it helped to work side by side with AM and FM radios, integrating them into as a third frequency band into automobiles. And as Dave said, we're north of 35 million at Sirius XM today and growing rather robustly. And as Dave also mentioned, branching into the internet services. We acquired Pandora only a little over a year ago for the streaming services. And again, this is basically, you won't see satellite in the name. Do you have Sirius XM? Do you have DirecTV? Well, AT&T did all they could to destroy the brand value that we created in DirecTV over all those many years and put it as AT&T, something really descriptive of what it is, as he said sarcastically. But Sirius XM is going strong and growing. DirecTV, AT&T, not so much. So the bottom line that I've learned in all of my aerospace career was, follow the money, never be a technology in search of a marketplace. Basically observe and extrapolate consumer demands and needs, and then find the technologies to serve those and fulfill them. I think that was 3. Number 4 is have fun while you're doing it to the best you can. Anyway, I would love to and be happy to entertain any questions that we have at this time. And I'll kick it back over to you, Dave, to monitor. I don't know quite how we're going to do this, but let's give it a shot with Zoom.
Oh, that's terrific, Eddy. Thank you. Just a remarkable story told by the person who, more than any other, created what remains as the largest and I think most successful commercial space enterprise of the, now we're 7 decades or so into the space age. So maybe somebody will come along in decade 8 or 9 and surpass what you've done, but it's just a tremendous story. Before we get to the questions, I'll, in a virtual way, it's my pleasure to, on behalf of AIAA, to recognize you with this Space Commerce Award, which consists of a medal, which I'm not sure you can see here. Oops.
You can.
Can you see it? Okay. Well, the real one is on its way to you, Eddy, and a very nice certificate as well.
Dave,
yeah.
I was remiss that there are 2 of the lead people, neither of which would have made, and there are many, many more. I could go on for the next half hour and tick off all the names as if I was still with them today. But Bill Butterworth, who led all, AIAA member, who led all things technical and operationally to get us launched and beyond. Bill was also a Caltech graduate, aerospace engineering, AIAA member, was also most notably the backup astronaut for one of the shuttle missions. He was the backup astronaut to Greg Jarvis, who, as we know, perished in the shuttle, the first shuttle accident. The second is Jim Ramo. If you recognize that last name, it's correct. He's one of Cy Ramo's sons, pioneer in aerospace all on his own. But like many sons, don't follow their dad's footsteps. Jim was a veteran in the cable system management, saw where that was going, and came on board to help manage all the content acquisition and much of the regulatory agendas that we had to pursue to get the right to go. And we literally had to fight the cable industry every step of the way. And it would also be remiss to not acknowledge Jim Meyer and the late Joe Clayton at RCA, who were the 2 leaders at what was then RCA, later became Thompson Consumer Electronics, to develop the first not only receivers, but encoders as well. Joe went on, after he retired from RCA, to, for a brief time, run as CEO and be CEO of Sirius XM. So he was a convert from consumer electronics to satellite business. And Jim, to this day, Jim Meyer has been the CEO and will be through the end of this calendar year of Sirius XM satellite radio. So we converted 2 from the consumer electronics industry, and they too are both members of the Consumer Electronics Hall of Fame to satellite-based businesses. Sorry to interrupt you, Dave, but I neglected to mention those 4 individuals.
No, that's terrific, Eddy. Well, we have a number of questions that are coming in, and while we tabulate those, let me start by going back to an episode that you mentioned briefly, your trip to Dallas to present to the General Motors board. And I guess the question here is, how different do you think history might have been if you were trying to sell this concept to the old Hughes as opposed to the then GM Hughes Electronics? How more challenging might it have been or not to get the green light for the multi-$100 million investment that was necessary to create the early infrastructure for DirecTV?
Simply put, I think it would have never happened if we were not, didn't have the parent of GM. We would have had to either go get partners or raise money in the financial markets. And I think few people had the vision of that. GM was used to making multi-$100 million investments in things that paid off over time. They got consumers, they got it. Hughes itself had never been in the consumer business at all. So we were looked upon as, oh, the weirdos over there still in El Segundo. What are they doing now? Are they effing crazy? Okay. GM got it. It also helped that the then chairman of GM, his brother was the CFO of Hughes, and I'm talking about Jack Smith at GM and Mike Smith at Hughes. And again, in following the money, GM got it, approved it in one fell swoop. The core of us had credibility from the old Galaxy days at Hughes Communications, and away we went.
Oh, terrific. A couple other questions that have come in, and I'm looking at the list here. And you mentioned a number of these, but what were some of the real critical technological ingredients that enabled DirecTV's success throughout the 90s that might not have been there a decade earlier? And I think you alluded to a number of those. And then beyond the technology, what other ingredients had to be brought to bear to make this a really successful business that could be marketed and sold to tens of millions of households around the country?
Well, let me lay a little bit of groundwork. It's a great question. The landscape had already been defined, and it was defined at a now famous speech that none other than John Malone, who was, personified cable with TCI at the time, and he painted a vision of a 500 channel universe. And people in cable thought he was crazy because if you look at the capability of cable systems at the time, they had a capacity with their bandwidth and analog distribution of probably no more than 60, maybe 70, if you're lucky, channels that any one cable system could deliver. The demand was there. The content, people were creating more content than they had bandwidth for. And we, of course, had to look beyond that, and digital was the only way. He said that at the Western Cable Show, I believe in 1990 or 91. I don't remember exactly, but that became our mantra. And he was mocked, of course, by 500 channels, nothing to watch. I think Bruce Springsteen actually incorporated that in lyrics of one of his songs. But we took it very seriously because as we were talking to content providers, they wanted more and more, and they were frustrated by the cable operators in not having the bandwidth. So we looked, and that's why we went to help with RCA and with Thompson. And by the way, RCA and the rest of the consumer electronics industry had never launched a product that sold anywhere close to 1 million in the first year. And they trusted us. They built it. The early prototypes, when we gave the difficult and more challenging video content material to them, they got it to perfection. Basketball games looked like sequences of orange comets arcing across the floorboards. And that's because we had to do a lot of the legwork with a lot of other subject matter experts in digital video compression and how to do that. We actually delayed the launch of the business because it wasn't good enough from early 1994 to mid 94. That was a conscious decision that we made. And while everyone was disappointed, they would have been more disappointed had they seen what we could do by that time. So getting that done, and just to give you a comparison, the most that a 376 satellite could have done at the time in the 80s was 24 channels at 10 watts of power, 10 watts measured at the satellite. Well, the 601 allowed us over 30 channels at 125 watts each. And that allowed a higher EIRP. Yes, the frequency was different, but a much smaller dish. And that's why we got that's why we got the size of the dish down by that heavier, that more capacity. Also, the bigger satellites had the solar arrays that were 3-axis positioned so that they're constantly the full array pointing at the sun, as opposed to only the roughly 60 degrees, and then with the cosine effect of inefficiency on a spinning drum satellite, power that payload. So, and even the antenna design was not just a splotch of uniform EIRP. We looked at it from, again, a geographic and consumer point of view. The arid climates of the southwestern United States that had very little rainfall, very few days a year, did not need the same power as, for example, you did in South Florida, where half of the days you have a whole lot of rain, and you needed more power there. We shaped the beam even there, which laid the groundwork for the spot beams and frequency use we did for the local channel satellites later on. So those were some of the technologies that we were fortunate enough to have, and then shape them to our customer needs, knowing what the customers were and what they needed.
Terrific, thank you, Eddie. Let me pass along a couple of questions that we have from the audience. Here's one. Since AIAA has a lot of young professionals in its membership, mostly engineers and scientists, what recommendations might you have for early career people that have good technical backgrounds but now want to build their knowledge and their capabilities in business?
Sure. I think that, all of you who are listening to this and who are getting, I started as AIAA as a student member. I remember the campaign out at Cal Poly Pomona, going around getting students to sign up. If you're still a student, study hard, get that. If you have electives, try to take them in business, no finance. No, K-N-O-W, finance. Understand what a balance sheet is, understand what return on investment is, because that is the way of the world these days. And try to take consumer marketing courses to the extent that you can. And just be aware, read as much as you can. Look at all these startups that are coming. If they are merely a technology in search of a marketplace, skip, move on to something else. Go to something that you know there is a consumer demand for, and work for that company and learn from the old farts like me, okay, what you need, but then apply what it is you know, and don't be hidebound to just doing it one way. The way of the internet is with us, and in many cases, DirecTV, and for that matter, once SiriusXM launches its penultimate replacement satellite next month, Elon, if you're listening, no more delays, please. I know your launch this weekend was of tantamount importance, but we do need that launch. And SpaceX, I know you're a sponsor of this, and there's an example of another terrific company to be working for right now. And then our final satellite in replacement will be mid next year. But after that, given that satellites now, these days, have 15 to 20 year lifespans as opposed to 9 to 10 year, those will probably be the last satellites that either SiriusXM and I think DirecTV has launched, because the way you're going with 5G deployment and everything else, I don't think satellites will be necessary. There's a huge terrestrial network of SiriusXM repeaters all over the urban areas of the United States, because satellites don't penetrate tall buildings, and if you're going down Fifth Avenue in New York, you're not going to get the satellite signal, but lo and behold, SiriusXM still works. That's because of terrestrial repeaters. And think about that for a second. How do you seamlessly transition from satellite to terrestrial with the delays and all of that? Satellite is not the answer for everything. There's latency issues, and those are dictated by, at least with geosynchronous satellites, by the physics of it and where they're located. But that's why so many of the newer systems that are being proposed and in fact launched right now for universal internet access for very rural areas are important. Go with where you think consumers will want to buy something or have a service. And if you keep that as your number one rule and where to go, you won't go wrong. And broaden yourself. Make yourself as broad as you possibly can. I expose myself to many aspects of the business, and that's why I've been of value to boards that are definitely not aerospace and not even satellite related. If you look at the rest of my CV, I'm on Broadcom's board, I was on TiVo's board, I was on Converse's board before they were bought out by Nike. By the way, there's a brilliant lesson to be learned there. Nike bought Converse, but you'd never know it because Converse still exists today, even 20 plus years after the acquisition, as a standalone brand. And Phil Knight had a sublimated enough ego to not have to put his name on everything.
Terrific advice. I know with much greater interest now than a couple of decades ago among AIAA members, including, of course, the young members, and potentially being satellite entrepreneurs themselves. And so I think they'll benefit tremendously from taking that advice to heart. Another question that's come in, Eddy, is close to something you just alluded to. What do you think the business prospects are for the new very large constellations, mostly low orbit, some medium orbit altitude satellites that are focused on providing broadband communications to underserved geographic areas, both in the US and other developing countries, and also in locations around the world that don't have the same sort of terrestrial infrastructure that we enjoy?
Well, I think the United States may develop the terrestrial infrastructure to go everywhere, but there are many areas in rural America where obviously cable still doesn't exist and never will exist. It's up to 5G to fill those in. And if 5G doesn't get there, because for 5G to work, you got to put towers up, and we know how expensive that can be. And if the payback is there, great. But I'm sure the folks that have looked at that have come to the conclusion that there's at least a generation or maybe two of LEO satellites to serve that market, and the payback will be there. As long as the payback is within one life cycle of the satellite system that gives you the kind of return on capital that investors are going to want, and that your founders and all your employees are going to benefit from an IPO, it'll be a success. So validate the business plan. There's plenty of groups out there, the market research groups. Gartner is one. There are many others that look at the total accessible market and the total serviceable market, and what percent of those do you think will actually buy, and what's the consumer proposition at the end? How much per month are you willing to pay? And if you're in a rural area and you need that, you'll be willing to pay more than you will in an urban area, but not astronomically more.
Very good. Thank you. Well, I think we have time for one more question, and let me look at the list here. I'll maybe modify this one just a bit. Beyond communications, what other opportunities that involve space technology in some way are intriguing to you, if any, Eddy?
Well, since retirement and looking at that, I don't look at it day by day, but I know there's got to be some. I think that the folks at SpaceX and others are basically banking on enough new technologies that are space-based to keep manufacturing rockets, launch vehicles, and even those, the price is coming down. I think the most fantastic video that I've seen in all my life, and I've been at many satellite launches down at the Cape and elsewhere, but the most amazing one was the SpaceX video of the two boosters landing side by side to be reused for future SpaceX missions. That in and of itself is even more technologically challenging, and I never thought I'd see the day. Hadn't even thought of the idea of doing that. And kudos to SpaceX and their team for coming up with that to further drive the cost down and make some of these other technologies more accessible and more feasible to end up serving consumers.
Well, great. Well, I think we've just about run out of the allotted time, Eddy, but again, I want to, on behalf of AIAA, congratulate you for receiving the Space Commerce Award for this year, and more importantly, for just an exceptional trailblazing career in two of the largest and most successful satellite-based businesses that have been created so far in the space age. Thank you very much. And as I look at the list of chat items, lots and lots of congratulations on a great lecture, fantastic talk from the group. So again, thank you very much, and we'll get the hardware on its way to you shortly.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Dave.
Thanks to Mary and the team, and for all of you for attending, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this year's Ascend conference.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you
so
for having
much.
me. This was great. Eddy, what a fascinating story. Thank you.